We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Dalet Amud Aleph Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 74a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing Rabbi Shimon's opinion in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says that a minchas chote of Kohanim. Now, normally the mincha of Kohanim, there is no kmitza taken at all. There's no fistful taken at all. It's entirely burned. But Rabbi Shimon says that the minchas chote shel Kohanim, the kmitza actually is taken, and it's burned separately, and the remainder is burned separately. And the Gemara now is bringing a brisa in which Rabbi Shimon is saying that he learns the pasuk as follows: Minchas chote shel Kohanim, k'minchas chote shel Yisrael. That the minchas chote, the mincha of the sinner brought by the Kohanim, brought by a Kohen, is the same as the minchas chote of Yisrael in the following manner: Ma minchas chote shel Yisrael nikmetzes, just like the minchas chote of Yisrael, the kometz is taken. Af minchas chote shel Kohanim nikmetzes, so to the minchas chote of Kohanim, the kometz is taken. Now, ima minchas chote shel Yisrael nikmetzes v'shireh nacholin. Whereas by the minchas chote of Yisrael, the kmitz is taken, but the remainder is eaten, and one might say af minchas chote shel Kohanim nikmetzes v'shireh nacholin. Maybe one would argue that the minchas chote of Kohanim also should be nikmetzes, the kometz should be taken, and the remainder should be eaten. Talmud lomar, the pasuk says la kohen kamincha. It means la kohen kamincha v'lo leishim kamincha. It means to say it is for the kohen like a mincha, but in terms of burning on the fire, it's not exactly like that. Haketzad, how so? Kometz kara biatzmo. The way it works is as follows: the kometz is offered on its own, the shirayim kraven biatzmon, and the shirayim, the remainder, they are offered on their own. And Rashi explains, La Kohen Kamincha Kilomer, as if to say, Kol Sheyesh La Kohen Lasos, but everything that the Kohen is doing, Yehei Kaminchas Chote Shal Yisrael. In that manner, it should be like the Minchas Chote Shal Yisrael, the Nikmetzes, that the Kmitz is taken. Velo Le'ishim Kamincha, but not in terms of the fire, meaning Le'inyan Mizbeach, as far as the Mizbeach Ein Shavin, they're not the same. Minchas Chote Shal Kohanim and Minchas Chote Shal Yisrael. The Minchas Chote of Kohanim and the Minchas Chote of Yisrael are not the same. The Shiore Minchas Chote Shal Yisrael Nechol, because the remainder of the Minchas Chote of Yisrael is eaten, minchas chote shel Kohanim kareven, and again the remainder by the minchas chote of Kohanim that is offered on the mizbeach. And the Gemara continues and asks, Hashetei avodasa kashay rabo. This idea that avodasa kashay rabo, this is the beginning of the brisa quoted on the previous summit. It learned from this pasuk la kohen kamincha. It learned from the pasuk that, let's say a kohen sins and he has to bring a minchas chote, so then he himself can be the kohen who brings that carbon. And it's learned from this pasuk. And so the Gemara is asking, mehacha nafka, is that really learned from here? But mehasam nafka, it's learned from there. It's learned from the following source: Minayin la kohen shabo makriv karbonosav. So from where do we know that a Kohen can come and offer his karbonos anytime that he wants? Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, Uva b'chol avas nafsho v'sheiris, that he can come and he can serve, and so therefore that should be the source. And the Gemara says, Imei hasam, if it's only the source from there, havamina, then one would think, Hanimili davar she'ein ba'al chet. That's true if it's something, a carbon that's being brought not for a sin. Avol davar sheba'al chet, but if it's something being brought for a sin, so then eimolo, one might say that is not the case. Rashi explains, davar haba'al chet kagon minchas chote. For example, our case of minchas chote, again, one might think that is not the case, and that's why we need the second source. But the Gemara continues, V'hanami mehacha nafka, but this also is learned from here. Mehasam nafka, but we have another source for that. We learn from there, from the following pasuk. V'chiper hakohen ala nefesh hashogeges b'chota b'shkaga. It says the Kohen, he brings this as a kapara for the one who sins b'shogeg. Melami, this teaches shahakohen mischaper al yedei atzma, that a Kohen can get an atonement through himself. He himself can do the service. And so therefore, again, we seem to have a source for this idea, even by a sin. And the Gemara continues and answers, Imeahu, if I only had that source, Hava mina hani mili b'shogeg, we would say, one might think that's only true by a sin that's b'shogeg. Avol b'mezid lo, but let's say it's on purpose. No, we would not say that. Kamash molon, and so that's what this source is teaching, that it's true even b'mezid. The Gemara says, b'mezid hechem ashkachas la, where do we have b'mezid, that a person brings a carbon? And the Gemara answers, b'zadon shvua, you can have an oath which is done on purpose, and zadon shvua, a situation of zadon shvua, that can be a case where a carbon is brought. And Rashi explains, Avol amazed could go in hechad to have nami amazed. You can have a case that's b'mezid, could go in asham charufa. There's the case of the asham charufa, ushmias kol, and shmias kol then involves a shvua lo yakrav biatzmo. So there, one might think he doesn't bring it himself. Kamash Malan Vaisal Kohen Kamincha, that's the pasuk. The Haikrav Minchas Chote de Shvuas Ha'edus Ksiv. That's written by Minchas Chote and it involves Shvua. That's the case of Shvuas Ha'edus, somebody who takes a false oath in terms of knowing testimony. And so again, that's the reason why this pasuk is needed. And the Gemara continues. Tanya Yidach, we learned in another brisa. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Minchas chote shel kohanim nikmetzes. The minchas chote of kohanim, the kometz is taken. V'hakometz karav b'fnei atzmo, and the kometz is offered on its own. V'hashirayim kreven b'fnei atzmo, and the shirayim, the remainder, they are offered on their own. Rabbi Lozer, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Lozer, Rabbi Shimon says, Hakometz karav b'atzmo, the kometz is offered on its own. V'hashirayim, but the shirayim, they are mispazer, and they're actually scattered al beis hadeshin on the area of the ashes. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, Have bo Rabbi Yochanan wondered about this. Beis hadeshin dehecha, which beis hadeshin are we talking about? If we're talking about the Beis Hadeshin above, meaning on the Mizbeach itself, essentially offered on the Mizbeach, Hainu Avu, that's exactly the same as his father is saying, meaning Rabbi Lozer, Rabbi Shimon then would just be saying that it's offered on the Mizbeach, just like Rabbi Shimon. So that can't be. And Idelamat, if we're talking about the ashes below that are done on the floor by the Mizbeach, so Yesh Loch Davar Shekarav Lamat, is something ever offered below? Does that make any sense? And the Gemara continues, Amar Le, Rabbi Abba said to him, Dil Mali'ibud. No, maybe it just means that it should be destroyed. It doesn't mean that it's really being offered. So Achichu Allah, they laughed about this. V'chiyesh loch davar shekarav le'ibud, is there something that is offered for the purpose of being destroyed? And the Rashi Ksaviyat explains, if it's going to be on the Mizbeach, kilomar shemakriv hashirayim al gavi ha-mizbeach, meaning he offers the remainder on the Mizbeach, hainu avud, that's exactly what his father said. And idalamata al shefach hadeshet ba'azara, if it's in the place of the ashes in the Azara, and then the Gemara said, yesh lach davar shekarav libud, is there something that's offered to be destroyed, sheyafrishu lechatchila lekach, that it's separated lechatchila in the first place for that. And again, the Gemara expressed wonder at that idea. And the Gemara continues, Tani Avud Rabbi Avin, the father of Rabbi Avin taught, and this is really being brought as a defense of Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Shimon. Again, Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Shimon says that the minchas chote of a kohen, the remainder is burned on the Beis Hadeshin, it's essentially destroyed, and here we're bringing a proof to this idea. It says in the pasuk, Kol minchas kohen kolil tiyeh, it says all minchas kohen should be totally burned, and lo seyachal, and it shouldn't be eaten. And so the Brisa says, La'achilo hi kashtiya, it's being compared, as far as achilo, the comparison over here is to the minchas chavitin. The pasuk right before talked about the minchas chavitin, which is the mincha of the Kohen Gadol. It's brought half in the morning and half in the afternoon, and that's entirely burned on the Mizbeach. And so now the pasuk is saying, when it comes to the minchas Kohen, it's compared as far as achila is concerned, v'lo l'davar acher, not for anything else. And what that essentially means is, lo seyachel, this minchas Kohen shouldn't be eaten, but in no other ways is it similar to the chavitin, in the sense that the chavitin is entirely burned on the Mizbeach, whereas over here, the remainder is going to be burned, and mispazrin essentially al beis hadesh, and that's what it means v'lo l'davar acher. But the Gemara continues and asks, my kamar, what exactly is being said in this brisa? In other words, how exactly are we interpreting the pasuk? Amar Abaya says, hachi kamar, this is how we interpret the pasuk. Kol minchas kohen lo seyachel, all minchas kohen should not be eaten, and that's chovaso, that's going on an obligation minchas kohen, like a minchas chote. And we should note, it's going to be noted in a moment, that Abaya is taking the end of the pasuk. Kol minchas kohen, first it says kol iltia, and then it says lo seyachel, and he's putting the lo seyachel in the beginning of the pasuk. So kol minchas kohen lo seyachel chovaso, that refers to the minchas chote, it shouldn't be eaten, but it's not burned in the regular way. And then kol iltia, when it says kol iltia nidvaso, that's the donated mincha, that's just entirely burned on the mizbeach, the minchas kohen, that's an adava. And so the Gemara continues, Amar le Rava said to Abaya, you think that's how to interpret the pasuk? Sakina charifa mifsake kra, you take a sharp knife and you cut up the psukim, you're butchering the pasuk, you're taking the end of the pasuk, you're moving it around. Elamar Rava, rather Rava says, Kol minchas kohen kol tiyah, when it says kol minchas kohen kol tiyah, now we're interpreting the pasuk in order, that is nidvaso, that's talking about his nedava, in a situation of nedava, kol tiyah. And lo seyachel, and when it says lo seyachel, that's chovaso, that's referring to chovaso, that's referring to the mincha of his obligation. In other words, the way that Rav is interpreting it, still essentially the same idea. The minchas chote is going to be lo seyachel, and it's going to be burned at Beis Hadeshin, but now we're interpreting the pasuk in order. And the Rashi Ksaviyat explains, Tani Avud Rabbi Avin, the father of Rabbi Avin taught, L'turutze time of Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Shimon. This is to answer for Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Shimon. Devadai li'ibud karav, certainly again, when we're talking about the shirayim of the minchas chote, it is essentially destroyed on the Beis Hadeshin. La'achilo hikashtiv, we're comparing it for eating, meaning minchas kohen l'chavitin, the minchas kohen is compared to the chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, shelo te'achel, it shouldn't be eaten, v'lo l'davar acher, but it's not compared in any other way. She'ashirayim miskarvin, meaning we're not going to offer the shirayim, elavadei mispazrin, rather they're going to be scattered on the Beis Hadeshin. Maiko Amar, what exactly are we saying? What the Gemara is asking is, the pasuk says it should be burned, and now we're saying it shouldn't be burned on the Mizbeach. What's going on? So lo seyachel mahader minchas chovaso shel kohen. So lo seyachel, we initially say it's going on the minchas chovaso. Kilomar lo seyachel v'kolil nami have, meaning to say lo seyachel, it shouldn't be eaten. V'kolil nami have, and it should also be burned. V'ikula krab b'chad mincha mishtay. Now, if that's all talking about one mincha, likasav kolil tia, it should just say kolil tia. V'ano yadana de lo seyachel, and then I'm going to know that it's lo seyachel. And so then the response was sakina charifa mifsek kroy legavoy klomer de dorish seifa de krol reisha. You're moving the end of the pasuk to the beginning, and so therefore Rava darshaned it in the fashion in which he darshaned it. And so the Gemara continues and asks ve'epachana, but why don't I reverse it? In other words, why am I saying that the minchas chovaso, that it's the minchas chote, that's the one that the remainder is burned on the Beis Hadeshen, and then the nidvaso, the one that is a nedava of the kohen, that's the one that's simply entirely burned on the mizbeach. I should reverse it. We should say the nedava is the one that's scattered on the Beis Hadeshen. And the Gemara says, Mistaber nidvaso havalei l'rebuye. It makes sense to say that the nedava is the one that's being included. Shekain tadira lochati basim reiche, because that is a carbon which is tadira, it's frequent, lochati, it's not for sin, and basim reiche, it smells good, and essentially, therefore, that's the one that should be compared to the chavisin. But the Gemara continues, adarab, on the contrary, we can argue, chovaso havalei l'rebuye, let's include, instead, chovaso is obligation, the minchas chote, because that's also similar to chavisin, shekain isaron, because that's an isaron, it's an asira so'efa, and chova, it's also an obligation. And the Gemara says to that, hanach nefisha, no, but the first set of similarities, they are more plentiful, and therefore, again, we compare nidvaso and not the chovaso. And the Gemara continues, V'Rabbanan, now according to the Rabbanan, these are the Rabbanan who argue in Rabbi Shimon, they say the minchas chote of the kohen, it's entirely burned like any other mincha of the kohen. It's not that you take the kometz and then you burn the kometz and you burn the shirayim. So the Rabbanan, hai kol minchas kohen kolel tia lo seyachel, ma'yav delay. What do they do with this pasuk of kol minchas kohen kolel tia lo seyachel? And the Gemara continues and answers, Mi boy lehu l'chidetanya. They need it for what's taught in the following brisa. Ein liela el yona b'chol taktor. I only know what was mentioned above. That's the chavisin. That should be entirely burned. V'tachton, and what's mentioned below seyachel, the minchas kohen, that's going to be not to be eaten. Minayin liten es amar shel zeh b'zeh v'es amar shel zeh b'zeh. How do I know to apply kolel taktor to the tachtona and to apply lo seyachel to the el yona? Talmud lomer kolel gzeir shav. It says kolel twice as a gzeir Shava to compare the two. Nemar kan kolel, it says over here kolel, it's entirely burned. V'nemar lahalan kolel, it says further on kolel. Malahalan b'kolel takter, afkan b'kolel takter, just like over there it's entirely burned, so too here it's entirely burned. Umakan liten lo sasei al achilaso, and just like over here there's a negative commandment on eating it, af lahalan liten lo sasei al achilaso, so too further on there's a negative commandment on eating it. And Rashi explains, V'Rabbanan depligio led Rabbi Shimon, the Rabbanan who argue Rabbi Shimon. V'yamri de minchas kohanim eina nikmetzes. They say the mincha of kohanim, that you never take a fistful, and you just burn the entire thing. So hai kram, hai darshibe. So what do they do with this pasuk, which has lo seyachel and also has it's entirely burned? And the answer is El Yona Chavisin Ksibuhu. By the Chavisin, it's written Kolel Takter. It says Kolel Takter. Valachilasa ain't over bala, but there's no negative commandment by the eating. And Tachtona, what's mentioned below, that's Shar Minchas Kohanim Lamata. That's other Minchas Kohanim. Below Seyachel, there it says don't eat it. V'Kolel lo have it, but it's not an issue of entirely burned. And so Minayin Lita and Shayu. And so from where do we know that we should apply that Shnehem Kolel, that they should both be burned? V'lo Sasel Achila, and there should be a negative commandment on the Achila. So it says Kolel Takter, and it says kolel tia, and so therefore essentially we make that gezeira shava. And the Gemara continues, Boy Ravina asks the following question, Kohen sha'achal minhu emurin, let's say a Kohen eats from the emurin, from the sacrificial portions, these are the parts of a carbon that are supposed to be burned on the Mizbeach, and instead the Kohen eats from it, Mahu, so what's the halacha? Lav dezoris, the negative commandment by a non-Kohen eating something he's not supposed to eat. Rashi explains, Minhu emurim, kloyos v'yoseres hakavid, again these are the various parts that are burned on the Mizbeach. The kloyos refers to the kidneys, the yoseres hakavid is the lobe of the liver. Lav dezoris, the lav by a non-Kohen, v'chol zor lo yochal kodesh, it says a non-Kohen cannot eat kodesh, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Dalid Amud Beis.